Welcome to Resilience Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Osterlink. This show is about building better humans, institutions, and systems. On the show, I'll be interviewing many different experts from across many different fields, including human optimization, health and fitness, team building, mind-body medicine. In the institutional space, we're looking at different institutions and how we can create new ones, new models and maps, including in medicine, in education, in intelligence community, in law enforcement, in the military, especially in the special operations community. Thanks for being here and enjoy the show.
What if the key to high performance was actually friendship? Not forced team building, not another offsite, but real human connection. Today's guest has spent decades exploring exactly that. Raj Mehta is a speaker, consultant, and personal science pioneer who helps leaders and teams better understand themselves and each other so they can build real trust, connection, and performance. He worked in innovation at places like NASA, Apple, and Adobe, studied aerospace engineering at Princeton and Stanford, and now leads work through mapping ourselves and the Atlas of Care, focus on culture, self-awareness, and collective insight. He is also the author of Camaraderie, a modern leader's guide to building joyful, high-performing cultures, coming out in July of 2026. What I appreciate about Raj's work is this. He's not asking leaders to choose between results and relationships. He's showing that the best results come from the right relationships. Raj, welcome. Let's have some fun with this.
Mike, good to be here.
Good to have you here. And I already apologized to you offline, but I appreciate your flexibility over this last year because I've been really trying to have you on for a long time now. So I love the work that you do and the way you think about relationships. But before we kind of in the business space and in the corporate world, before we kind of dive into that, like who is Raj? What formative experiences led you to have these realizations in the work that you presently do? You've done for a while now.
It's been kind of a long meandering path of, it's not like I started off 20 years ago deciding I'm going to focus on camaraderie. This is important. It was honestly, and I'll tell you the quick version of this story going forward, but it was like one thing after the other happens and I'm curious. I can be tenacious at times. And it's like being open to experiences, being open to the unexpected. That really helped. And, otherwise, my background, so way back, once upon a time, I was an immigrant from India, came to the US when I was 10, grew up in New
Yeah.
Jersey, studied aerospace engineering, as you said, and worked for NASA, went to business school, worked in the tech industry for a long time. And, sort of those first 25 years of my professional career, I was very much, a technology person, a science person, and
Mhm.
so forth.
Mhm.
And and yet, so much of what I learned there was foundational to what I've learned in paying attention to how we people care for each other, how we thrive as families, as organizations, as communities. And just, to highlight a couple of those things, if you work at
Please.
NASA, you clearly appreciate that things are complicated. And it's you do your best to simplify so that you can actually solve things, but you always keep in mind the world is far more complex than you understand. And so just kind of know that. Don't be overconfident in whatever you're saying. Stay alert. And so appreciating this importance of the complexity of the world and never taking things for granted. And whether that's how a person acts day to day, it's like, why don't they do that? Well,
Mm.
it's probably something behind that. And in that sense, also, I came to appreciate deeply the importance of our human perspectives on things. Uh, NASA's got tons of technology. We still have test pilots that are human beings because there's some things we simply cannot sort of gather from gadgets and so forth, and things that we humans are amazingly good at, sort of sort of seeing all this thing happening and have what we think of as a gut sense of what is right. Because we can't articulate it in clear words and clear formulas, but we know it's right, and so we rely on that. Also, from my world, years is spent in sort of technology and so forth. Um, a lot of my work was on very, very, very early product ideas. So things that weren't in the marketplace, the category didn't exist. You can't run around asking people what they want when they've never thought of such a silly thing. And so it's like deeply sort of anthropological work. you are trying to understand their lives in a way better than they do, to sort of observe these unmet needs, keeping with respectful that you don't know their lives, but on this thing, like a long time ago, I paid attention to when do we not take photos? Seems like a silly question, but it's stuff we take for granted now, taking pictures of whiteboards and where you parked your car, which this is now 35 years ago, allowed me to sort of see a path forward for digital cameras
Nice.
and so
Okay.
forth. But about 20 years ago, while honestly, I was actually investigating some wireless technology, a possible use in the healthcare world. Turned out it wasn't, but the healthcare people kept talking to me about a problem they called non-adherence,
Yeah.
and
Okay. Great. Right.
which basically means you're not doing what your doctor told you to do.
Right.
You're not taking your pills at the right time and the right dose, but more extensively, that you don't do what your doctors tell you to do. And thinking about that and coming to feel that the health industry is blaming people for this was just got me fired up. It's like, no, they're wrong. This is just not right. It's like our day-to-day lives are so much more complicated than they're giving credence to. And in fact,
Okay.
they, doctors, nurses, don't do a better job on this either. That led me to sort of fall down the rabbit hole into looking deeply into how do we care for each other, our families day to day. And it led to all sorts of sort of experimentation and exploration. Again, my sort of NASA background turned in kind of handy for that. But really, I did a lot of groundbreaking research into gathering data on how do we care for each other, which led to developing ways that enabled anybody to sort of explore their own life. So I think of big science as like, smart scientists like me studying those people. And personal science, the idea, how can you explore your own life in a sort of a disciplined way? And so I did a lot of work sort of developing tools and methods for this. And I've taught these broadly. I mean, I've taught them to 8-year-olds and teenagers and 90-year-olds, SEALs, rabbis, house cleaners. Turns out to be this is human. And it was that work that eventually woke me up to see how fundamentally important this ability to explore your own life, ability to understand sort of the ecosystem that you're in, the other people that you're in, how critical that was for camaraderie.
Let me step back if you don't mind before you
No,
head down that
please,
path
that's
because
kind of
that's
a
brilliant.
50 years,
Yeah.
you know?
No, I love that because what I'm curious about is like, how did you create the conditions in your own mind to explore those questions? Is it, I mean, I'll throw out some things, but that might not be. Are you a meditator? Do you go out in nature? Do you do this through conversation? Where do the ideas come from that you then explore?
Well, there's two parts to that. One is like what attracts me to explore in the first place, and then how do I go about doing it?
Yes, yes.
And so there was a long time ago, it must back in college days, I learned about this architect, Daniel Burnham. He was a turn of the last century. And if you know the Flatiron Building in New York, which was the world's biggest skyscraper for a long time, that was him and so forth. Very famous architect back then. One of his most powerful quotes is, "Make no small plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." And,
Oh, that's a great
and that
quote.
really is like, grabbed me. It's like, okay, there's all sorts of really big ideas in the world that one could work on. No guarantees of success. They're big and hard because they're big and hard. But wouldn't that be fun to work on those sorts of things? And so
Okay.
throughout my career, I've been drawn to questions, to problems that seem like, wow, if you could address that, that would have a huge impact,
Oh,
as opposed to what is admittedly actually very hard to do also, but is the like, let's make this 1% better. Let's make this 3% better. That can be very hard for established things. And
yeah,
yet
of course.
those aren't the sort of problems that attract me.
Mhm.
So it's this idea of, big unsolved problems is what attracts me. And then what helps me, in a sense, to do the exploration is that I've always been a very curious person. And so I've dived into all sorts of things. And being able to pull in ideas that simply occur to you, it's like, wait, I heard about that. I remember that. I talked to this person over there. And in so many fields, I mean, between just my NASA experience and my tech industry experience, that was pretty broad as well. But,
Mhm.
I was deeply into photography. I know various artists. I read a ton of anything that strikes me as interesting. And that kind of breadth of ideas constantly sort of churning around make the exploration possible.
Nice. I love that. I love that. So, just naturally curious, did you fall out of the womb like this, curious about the world you live in?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, who knows? These are sort of,
yeah.
metaphysical questions. How does that happen? I don't know. It's just the way I was born. I mean, I even in high school, I remember I don't know, I discovered um, just various science fiction books, and then I'd go and read the entire set of that
Collection.
person.
Yeah.
Um, in fact, when I was at NASA, I had done my undergraduate at Princeton, did my master's at Stanford. I was enrolled to do my PhD at Stanford, and it made sense. I was a good NASA scientist. I kept getting various awards, and this just seemed like the natural progression. And yet, I found myself very blasé about this success.
Mm.
And I realized that I just paying attention that my NASA colleagues, they would spend their free times reading engineering journals. I mean, this is really they were so into it. They were deeply into it, and of course that made them so brilliant at their work. Whereas in my free time, I'd go and read about anything, whether it's foreign policy or culture or so forth. And it started gnawing on me that if this was me, young 20-year-old, thinking that if I got my PhD and stayed on that line, that I would never be able to explore other ideas. Oh my gosh,
Mm.
don't do that. Which I know in retrospect was a silly thing because you can keep exploring even after you get a PhD, but never mind. But that's what sort of scared me into looking into other things. Like, how could I make these variety of interests part of my vocation, not just kind of hobbies?
Would you consider yourself like an interdisciplinary thinker or an integrated network or systems thinker?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. Are there particular authors that you read that you're like, man, if I was going to recommend four authors to someone, anything like
They
that?
bounce all over the place. I mean, I just a couple that come to mind right now because I had recently bought these books as gifts for friends. There was one called "The Dawn of Everything" by
Hmm.
David Wengrow and David another G. Anyway, The Dawn of Everything. It's this tome of it's a doorstop of a book, but it's absolutely brilliant about the history of the world.
Mm.
And it's what makes it fascinating is there's two very successful books. One called 'Sapiens by Yuval
Mm.
Noah
Mm.
Harari, very popular. I thought the book was amazing. And a decade earlier, Guns, Germs, and Steel by
Yeah.
um,
Um, Jared,
Jared Diamond, which I
Diamond.
also thought was brilliant. And I had read a little review of this book, The Dawn of Everything, where the reviewer said, well, they wrote Dawn of Everything because they were just kind of annoyed at those other two books being so popular when they're fundamentally flawed. And I'm like,
I love
okay,
that.
that's some chutzpah there. So, but yes, it was mind-blowing how,
Mm.
in a sense, we are misguided, kind of a narrow-minded view of the evolution of humanity in the sense of culture that you find in Diamond's book and Harari's book. So that one, I can recommend in spades. A fun one is called Sea Peoples, and it's really the question of how did the Polynesians get to where they are? How did the people on Easter Island and
Oh,
Tahiti and all the rest of it get to it? And it's written kind of like almost like a detective story, where the
interesting.
detectives are the European explorers and scientists and so forth. And so here you are, whatever, in the 1500s, the cook comes to these islands and he comes up with his explanations. And 100 years later, these scientists are exploring, they come up with their explanations. And they simply cannot figure out how did these people get here? It made no sense to them. The Polynesians kept telling him, well, we had these canoes, we travel across the ocean, we go back and forth. That's how we got there. This made absolutely no sense to, in a sense, the scientists, the explorers, because it was totally counter to everything they knew about
Mhm.
sailing the seas and navigating on the ocean and so forth. It just made no sense to them. And so it's this amazing story of, in a sense, the Western detectives trying to solve this problem. And only in the last few decades have they come to conclude that actually they got there exactly as they said. It just took us, in a sense, us, the Western world, so long to grok that it is possible to do what they were doing, and it made
Yeah.
perfect sense. So I love that book. It's just so eye-opening.
How do you keep your mind open and flexible and curious? Are you just always naturally that way? Like you hear something of interest, you go explore it, or do you have certain practices you do to
Mm.
kind of keep yourself from being what I would call a Johnny One Note? This is the thing.
But it's a funny question to ask because I think in the moment, I'm almost always like, "This is how it is. I know this is true." And so I'll get into conversations, shall we say, sometimes heated with friends who have alternative views. And, I'm sticking by it's like, makes so much sense. But fortunately for me, apparently the back of my mind is more open about these things.
Okay.
And so the conversation will keep twirling around. And so as an example, right now, 2 days ago, there were a few people that I've asked to read my draft of my book in great detail. Lots of other people I've little give pointers here and there, but for four people, I asked them, please read the whole thing and give me your feedback. And so I got feedback from one of my friends, Dawn, who's a brilliant anthropologist. And I'm looking through her notes, and oh my God, she had a lot to say. As I'm reading through this, I'm just fighting this. Like, no, I don't want to talk about that. No, I've done a good job covering this thing and so forth. So my initial reaction is like, I'm done. I am not addressing these things. But then, of course, over the last day, through the sleepless nights, I kept thinking over and over about what she's saying. It's like, damn it, I got to go deal with those things.
So
So
you don't let yourself get your own way in the end.
I try not to. Although, we're all human beings. Sometimes we
Of
just
course.
get stuck for a lot longer than you hope.
Right on. Right on.
The other thing I would add, Michael, that's really important, I found is essentially say yes to opportunities,
Mm,
especially opportunities that are different than what you've been involved in. Just say yes. Someone invited you. They presumably thought it would be interesting and worthwhile. Just go. Even if
I
it
love it.
seems, uh, I'll give you a couple of examples. About 15 years ago, I had to shut down my startup of that time. The 2008 financial crisis dried up venture funding. I couldn't get the next round. And so a friend of mine calls me and said, since you're not doing anything, ouch, that's not nice. Could you come and help me with something? Essentially, he had invited somebody to lead a week-long workshop. And my friend needed me to, one, essentially chauffeur the guy around, and two, just kind of be a gopher during the
Mhm.
workshop. It seems kind of, a low end task. And for this privilege, he would allow me to not pay to participate in the workshop. It's like, I'd never heard of this man. It's like, honestly, really? But I wasn't doing anything. And he was a friend who needed help. So say yes. Turned out his guest was a Chilean biologist philosopher named Umberto Maturana, who
Mm,
never heard of. Everybody else in the workshop was there because he was God.
mm,
And turned out it was just mind-blowing stuff. Um, and so it had a huge impact on me. I mean, it's hard to describe because we were just talking about normal things. Like, I mean, here we are in sort of this professional gathering, talk about what is love? And
mm,
how do you interact with each other? And what does this mean to resist change? What does it mean to make an error? Like these seemingly trivial sorts of questions, but turns out there's a lot of depth there. So it was mind blowing. At the time, it's like you're drinking from a fire hose. I got this much of it. And yet it stuck with me, right? Over time, more and more what was said back then made sense. So that was amazing. And then more recently, in the sense of like, must have been 4 years ago, I got invited to a day-long meeting of this organization that you may know of, the Commit Foundation. They
oh,
have
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
senior military officers and special operations people as they're transitioning to civilian life.
Mhm.
And I got invited, and I thought I was being invited to sit in the back and listen and learn something. Turns out I was being invited to be a mentor. It's like, honestly, what does what does a SEAL have to learn from me? It turned out that they were very interested in what people's careers were like because sort of in the civilian world, they had no idea. So anybody had an interesting story, they wanted to hear it. So I went, had a great time, and I discovered these people who I had zero interaction with before, practically anybody in the military, were so smart, so thoughtful, um, just nice, brilliant people. And so I've stayed in touch with so many of them, and I've learned so much from their insights. In fact, the trigger to me focusing on camaraderie was when one of them kindly, gently, forcefully pointed out to me that I was missing the point of my own work, that I was not
Wow.
appreciating how powerful it was. And so then this guy, Brian Cunningham, started explaining how he and other people of his rank knew that if you don't know yourself, you don't know your team, pretty much guaranteed to lose the battle. And that the work I had been doing was very much forging that sense of mutual knowledge, that sense of belonging, that sense of camaraderie, and that I had been viewing that as a nice extra. People are coming
Mhm.
to learn these things I want to teach them, and they're going away with feeling nicer with each other. Isn't that nice? Like the icing on
Okay.
the cake. And Brian was pointing out, no, that is the
That's
cake.
the thing. Okay.
That's the thing.
I love that.
So this
Yes.
whole
It's
point about saying yes.
a very small world because actually I co-lead a men's group with JC Glick, who runs Commit Foundation.
Ah,
Yeah.
small world.
He's is their executive director. So it's a very small world, which is fun. A little while ago, I took you off course because I had some questions for you. You talked about a project you're involved in, non-compliance, and that kind of led you to a deep dive into understanding how people actually live their life versus how doctors and nurses and other healthcare practitioners might encourage one to do things within their life. Walk us through that, like talk some of the lessons learned about humans and what we do and how that helped inform what you do now.
So the gist of the explanation, the generic explanation, the still approved explanation for non-adherence is that we patients either don't understand how important it is to do things properly, to take your pills at the right time and the right dose, to eat your broccoli, to go for a walk, whatever it is, that we don't understand how important it is, in which case apparently the solution is more education. Okay. This makes no sense because it turns out doctors and nurses are no better than us at adherence, and they're apparently educated. So this is a
Right.
nonsensical thing from the start. The other explanation is effectively that we're too lazy, that we'd prefer
Mhm.
sitting on the couch watching TV than going out and exercising or running or what have you, which seems slightly more plausible. And apparently the response to that is carrots and sticks to
Mm.
basically motivate people to do what they should do. And I started looking into this, and one thing I noticed was even for my self assigned health regimens. So there was one time, people are always telling me to drink my 8 glass of water a day. I was like, okay, that's easy advice. I can follow that. Pretty cheap. I can drink water. This is easy. And I discovered, of course, it was impossible. Like 4 o'clock would come about, and I could not remember how many glasses have I drank?
Mhm.
What am I going to do next? And I know people gave me all sorts of solutions to this, like carry around this jug of water and write one, two, three, four. It's like, no, that is not the way the world works. I'm not walking around with a jug of water kind of thing. Um, but so that appreciation that it wasn't the drinking the water that was hard, it was doing that act in the busyness of day to day life.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, it became clear why taking a pill is so hard. It's not the taking of the pill; it's that you're supposed to take your pill at 8 a.m., but you got to get the kids off to school. You got to get their lunches ready. Your boss is calling you on the phone. You just remembered that your car needs a tune up. All of this is going on in the context of busy life when you're juggling 17 balls in the air. Yes, this is actually really, really hard. So appreciating sort of the complexity of the world makes this task difficult. And then I started thinking about it from the perspective of a person named W. Edwards Deming. It's a very famous American statistician whose work sort of revolutionized the world of quality control in manufacturing and so many other places. And there's something called the Deming Prize, one of the world's most prestigious awards for quality. And to my sort of trivialization of 80 years of Deming's teaching, sort of my summary of it, is that if there's a defect at the end of the assembly line, the last thing you do is blame the workers. People like doing a good job. You hired good people. The problem is always it's an impossible task. The directions were wrong. Did you remember to turn on the power? Poor
Mm,
management. It's anything but your workers.
mm.
And in caring for ourselves, we, our families, do 99.9% of the work, day to day, hour to hour, to take care of ourselves. So we're the workers. Per Deming, don't blame the workers. It's
Okay,
someone else.
got it. Yep.
So it's these sorts of things that got me initially focusing on this. And then, I like to explore stuff. So this is easy to explore. You don't need some science study to do this. I go into people's homes. I visit friends, I visit family, I visit neighbors, and just be curious, sometimes called being nosy. Ask them, what do you do to care for yourself? And ask them at the practical level, why are these pills in the bathroom? Why are these pills in the kitchen? Just to understand what is their life like. And again, it became clear in spades, life was complicated. And that's why I trying to the medical establishment saying, just take your pill. How hard can it be? Totally missing the
So, like with that said, let's stick with the pills or whatever the
yeah,
broccoli or the exercise.
yeah.
Understanding how people actually live their lives, then how do you create a system or turn that into a habit that allows them to kind of stack that into what they already do, as opposed to like, oh, another thing I got to worry about.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right.
See.
There's one downside to the idea of habit,
Okay.
which is that the habit implies that you do this thing so much that it just becomes ingrained. You stop thinking
Mhm,
about it. You just do it. The
mhm.
problem with that idea is that life is dynamic. And what
Okay.
is the right thing to do at any moment could be very different. It's like, don't do that. And so,
Okay.
I think of it more about deeply developing your instincts so that instinctually you're doing the right thing. And so at the moment, this habit may be appropriate, but you don't actually want it locked in because
Okay.
things can change. So I think what's more important, well, let me start here. This is all about sort of knowing yourself, what is best for you, but really, more importantly, knowing yourself. Philosophers have been telling us to know yourself for a long time. Apparently, the wisdom of this and apparently our incompetence at this is, well known, shall we say. The thing is that we have today come to think of know yourself too narrowly. It's almost like
Okay.
what do you know about yourself sort of intellectually inside yourself and so forth. I want to point out that as a social species, as beings with a rather long lifespan, that knowing yourself has to be plural. It's you and the people around you. You are so deeply interconnected in your own lives that you cannot extract yourself from it. It makes no sense. You are part of this ecosystem. Two, know yourself is holistic. It includes that environment as well. Like, I'm not a runner, but if you are a really, competitive runner, you know yourself and how you respond differently when the weather is 70 degrees and humid and when it's 45 degrees and cool. It's not the same person, so you would respond differently. You take context into account. And thirdly, know yourself has to be dynamic. As we're just saying, circumstances change, and so, with that in mind, know yourself has to be ingrained. You have to build, in a sense, you have to hone your skills of observation so that you are observing and sort of acting instinctively as appropriate. So the question is more how do you hone your instincts? It can't
Yeah.
be that every hour you check in on yourself. It's like, how am I feeling? And so forth. It's more that every once in a while, you look deeply. You learn to observe. You take the time to analyze what you have learned and try to soak it in, which a little tangent, which is why relying on gadgets won't do it for you. It's
Mm.
too cheap learning. It's like you actually have to
Mm.
be deeply involved for that to become ingrained. It's not the number,
It's
it's your skills at observation.
it's interesting from a tech person to hear that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm like thrilled at the gadgetry. There's real
I know,
use
I
for
know.
this, but in terms of our own selves,
Mhm.
it's how do you build that instinct so that you're doing the right thing at the right time?
Yeah.
And again, this is not to slight, some amazing books about habit building that have
Mm.
been written over the last decade because they do give great advice. It's just, you know, the habit should be contextual.
So if I understand you correctly, if I'm a doctor and I'll give you a pill or a prescription to do X, Y, and Z, eh, if I understand it correctly, there's no universal thing that I can suggest to you that's going to work for you with everyone. I have to understand how you live your life to help figure out how this might work to get into your system, this pill or this
Yes,
exercise.
yes, yes. And
Okay.
I mean, yes, definitely. You have to appreciate that person's life. Otherwise, your advice is it might be good generic advice. It just may not be the right thing for this person.
Mhm.
As importantly, if you're that sort of advisor, the doctor, a friend, a coach, whatever, you have to keep in mind that you are not the expert in that person's life. That
Life. Okay.
person, even if they're very unobservant, knows more about their life than you do. And so at best, you have this symmetry of competence, the symmetry of incompetence.
Mhm.
So you, as the advisor, should never be assuming you know what is right for them. And we get ourselves into so much trouble when we do that.
Well, it's actually really interesting because I could apply that. I'm a trained marriage and family therapist, and I work with a lot of couples. And I say the same thing differently, different language, but I say the same thing to couples about each other.
Yes. Oh,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
My wife and I have been married now, I don't know, I think 43 years, and still surprise each other on, "I knew you." So yes, we really don't. To your point, there's a tool that I've developed, a paper and pencil tool called a care map. It's a process for thinking about your close friends and family and how you care for one another. And as part of that process, you end up making a drawing. Very simple drawing, stick figures and so forth, and arrows showing who's caring for whom. Honestly, simple. I've taught this to 8-year olds and 90-year olds, and powerful. Like a bunch of those seals got a lot of value out of
Nice.
doing this. Um, but I've had couples come to some of my workshops, and I don't say one way or the other how they should behave. But sometimes they choose to each draw their own care map, go through the process independently. Sometimes they choose to work on it together. And
Mm.
I pay no attention. Y'all do what you want to do. Always, the couples that do it separately are so astonished at how they discover their perspectives differ. And the conversation that that leads to
Mhm.
really is eye-opening for them,
Yeah.
because
Well,
it allows them
yeah.
to see that they're both there.
If you could re-inhabit yourself 30 years ago and then see how today, what would you say you've learned about human nature and human relationships that you didn't know 30 years ago through all your explorations?
Well, it's challenging to answer because 30 years ago, I wasn't particularly paying attention to this stuff. So,
Okay.
I can't really say what did I know then because
Fair enough.
but the last 20 years have been spent deeply diving into this. And so it's more like I can look back on something that happened, say, 35 years ago and have a richer perspective on what happened
Mm,
than I did before because I have such a richer appreciation of things.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's not go back 35 years. Let's go back when you first started exploring relationships and human dynamics that way.
Yeah. Well,
Anything
I think,
surprise you?
well, these two seemingly counterpoints. One is that each person is the expert in their own life, and two, how ignorant, unobservant we each are in our lives. It's like both are true. You know yourself better than anybody else, even if you're not observant, just because you're a human being that's living, and being completely shocked to discover how much people don't know about their own lives.
Yeah.
Things that should be obvious, not even deep stuff. As an example, there was one woman who was involved in a couple of the research projects I did, and she was in her 50s, had cystic fibrosis, was a
Mm.
retired physician. So she'd been taking care of herself with this serious illness for like 50 plus years, and
Mm.
someone who knows what they're doing. And so on one particular day, she said that she expected to spend 2 to 3 hours over the course of the next day on self care activities. Which, for someone who doesn't understand cystic fibrosis, like, oh my God, what are you doing? It's a significant amount of time. But anyway, that was her call. As it turned out, after I spent the day gathering data and all sorts of stuff, we discovered she had spent over 6 hours that day on self care activities, not counting her exercise regimen.
Okay.
And as we looked over the results, she was like, she does that every day. It's just since she's been doing it for so long, some of the times, like she was on it, uses a nebulizer to inhale
Mhm.
various things that you're sitting there for half an hour. And so she had used that time to basically catch up on Facebook or flip through YouTube videos or whatever. And so it
Okay.
had slipped her mind that she was spending that time on self care. Um,
Okay.
so it was eye opening to her. There was another person. I mean, these are all like seemingly trivial stories, but it just shows how we don't
Mhm.
know our lives.
Mhm.
This other person, she was also in her 50s. She was taking care of an adult son who had emotional issues, such that like 23 and a half hours of the day is a lovely child, lovely guy. But when disaster happens, it's a disaster. So she spends most of her time doing nothing on her couch, flipping through magazines, watching TV. Essentially, she can't do anything because she can't know when disaster
When?
strike.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
And so she had blamed herself for a long time on her laziness and so forth. But after seeing what her day really looked like, she was like, oh my God, I
Mm.
understand that I do not need to feel guilty about how tired I am. It's like, yes, you've been on 24/7 duty
Yeah.
for 20 years,
It's a long time.
right? It's just,
Yeah.
and this was eye opening. So it just went to show that we lack good understanding of our day to day lives.
Hey, do you have certain practices you recommend for self-knowledge, self-awareness?
Yeah, very much so. So as a generic idea, it's this point that anything that you are interested in, have confidence that you can explore that in a disciplined way. That
Mm.
the approach of science, observations, do some analysis, make some hypotheses, do some experiments, see what changes, but do it in a disciplined way is very, very, very accessible to you. I point out to people that if they're good at so many things in normal life, they're good at cooking, they're good at gardening, they're good at fly fishing, that they have the skills to be this deeply observant in a disciplined way. And so I encourage them to tap into those skills. So, if they're having sleep problems or they're trying to improve their, running, keep a log, pay attention,
Yeah.
make up assumptions, see if those are right. So that's the generic advice. It's easier to say than to do. But so I have developed over the last few years several what I think of as tools for self-exploration. And I really think of them as a starter kit because I
Mm.
could have 500 tools. None of them is perfect for your situation at the moment. So it's
Right,
a
right, right.
way to learn. They are useful. And these tools, collectively, one's about paying attention to your close family and friends. Another one is about basically listening to your body over the course of a day and so forth. Another one is about conversations and how they impact you. And these mapping ourselves tools, they're freely available on my website on mappingourselves.com. So anyone can get
Nice.
them.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of people have done that and so forth. The other part to add, though, is I have found that this kind of self exploration is so much more effective when you do it with others.
Nice.
So, and I think of this as an idea that I call collective self reflection.
Mm,
So each of you is paying attention to your own life, your sleep, your sneezes, whatever. But then you come together regularly to share your discoveries, your methods, your ahas, your conclusions, your experiments. And in that process of conversation, you learn so much more than if you do it by yourself. Like, as you try to explain yourself, you learn more about yourself. As you
mhm.
listen to them, you get ideas that apply to you. It also opens your mind to how different other people's lives are. And that process of being human together is what leads to those deep bonds, that camaraderie that I was talking about. Um, so, you know, the simple answer to your question is pay attention in a disciplined
Right.
way, tap into these new tools, do it with friends.
Now, you mentioned part of the title of your book. It's come out in
Yeah.
July. I'm going to have you back on to kind of do a deep dive into the book, but can you kind of give us a little teaser of what you and I will be talking about here in a little while when you come back on to
Sure.
talk about the
I
book?
mean, the arc of the book is interesting. So the book is written for people who want to improve, leaders who want to improve that team spirit, that sense of camaraderie in their organizations. If people aren't convinced that camaraderie and good team culture is important, they ain't going to read my book. They're not going to find anything valuable there. It's just like I'm not trying to convert the unconverted. So the arc of the book is the first third quarter of it or so is really about acknowledging this reality. What is camaraderie? What does it look like when it's flourishing? What does it look like when you're like, you're dog paddling and getting nowhere? Um, it's partly to help them recognize their own situation, partly to help the reader recognize that I recognize their situation, sort of establishing that comer. I spend a little bit of time, probably the smallest section of the book, on how did I get here with these ideas? Because I could just
Good.
jump into the ideas, but even though they're so obvious in retrospect, they are new. And
Mm,
so people sort of legitimately have this question like, well, it sounds good, but how do I believe this is true? Where's the proof? So I tell them of my journey to discovering these things. Part of the reason for the story is simply because people seem to think my journey is so curious. Like, how did an aerospace engineer start talking about love? Fine.
that's awesome.
The bulk of the book is on how do you build your skills for seeing. And I talk a lot about stories from the quantified self world, stories of people who have done amazing job on visualizing their daily life. I explain sort of the mapping ourselves tools,
Nice.
and explain this whole idea of the goal is to eventually do this collectively. It's not just self knowledge. It's this.
Mhm.
And then I close the book with essentially like, how do you, now that you've learned all of this stuff, how do you actually act? And the answer to that one is because people want to know, it's like, how do I convince people to join me? How do I get started? And it's like, well, okay. The answer is you lead by leading. You start with yourself. You start with
Mhm.
yourself and a few people that are willing to join you. Maybe your leadership team, maybe your closest peers, people that are willing to sort of play along with your idea that this is important. And then teach yourself these methods, try them, see what happens to you as a group. And once you've done that, then you can inspire others, the rest of
Mhm.
your team, the rest of your company, not by pointing them to some book by some smart guy in California, but by saying, I did this. Here's the impact that make it very first person, inspire them through your own stories. So that's the arc of the book. The why is camaraderie important? How do these ideas come to be? What are the ideas? How do you act?
That's awesome. Can't wait to read it and then have you back on to do a discussion. And I would imagine, like in the present day time, a lot of your time is spent writing, rewriting, engaging with your friends who've given you feedback. Yeah. And in your free time, what's exciting you these days, if you have any free time?
Well, I do. The other thing I do for on the work front is I do a lot of speeches on the
Yeah.
same topic and to local nonprofits, to businesses, and so forth. But otherwise, I do a lot of work in the community. I'm part of something called Leadership Mountain View. So
Mm.
we're constantly helping more and more people understand the city and sort of build a strong community within the city. Um, on my own time, I read a ton. Too many mysteries, but that's my junk food, along with all these serious books, like The Dawn of Everything. Um, I seem to waste a lot of time watching TV, although I am told that I am way below par on TV watching, but I do the best I can.
Uh-huh.
Um, Waste too much time following Arsenal, but this year we might be doing really well. So don't
That's
don't
good.
don't jinx it.
Yeah.
Um, and when I have a chance, I love to do photography.
What question did I not ask you that you'd like to answer?
It's funny. I think the one thing we might ask ourselves as a big question is, how is it that these seemingly obvious ideas that philosophers have been telling us for millennia have slipped our mind?
Mm,
How is it that we have forgotten that we're actually really skilled at observation? How is it that we've let somehow society convince us that we don't know? You hear people all the time, it's like, "Oh, I'm not a scientist," or "Talk to your doctor first." Like, no, think for yourself first. Ask your sister. We have to regain this self-confidence. Um, and along the way, of course, get really good at it.
mhm.
But it's both of those things. We've allowed ourselves to be kind of sidelined. I mean, if I was to get on a soapbox, I would say it's because we've had 150 years of ever more sophisticated marketing, which is used for people who have something to sell to convince you of the need for it. And there's nobody doing PSAs on how smart you are.
Nice. I really like
Right.
that. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like rediscover that you, yes, you are a smart, thoughtful, kind person and have the confidence to carry on with.
That's great. Thank you, Raj. I really like that.
Mm.
Where can people learn more about your work, the different offerings you have, things along those lines?
So the website is mappingourselves.com. It's easy enough, hopefully, to spell and find. Um, and I'm really not on social media. I mean, you'll find me on LinkedIn, but other than that, just very old school on that one.
We also have a newsletter that's available through your website too.
Yes, yes.
Okay. I definitely encourage people to sign up for it. I think it came out this morning or
I
yesterday,
I think it was a couple days ago, but yes,
a couple days ago. Okay. I
yeah,
read it this morning, but cool. Excellent. Raj, good to see you. Look forward to having you back to talk about your book. Appreciate this conversation. And thanks again for your time.
great. And I look forward to chatting with you again in a few months.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me, Mike.